The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the busy streets of the city. The sidewalks were filled with people hustling home from work, kids heading back from school, and a few others enjoying a moment of rest on nearby benches. Among the crowd was a young boy named Marcus, who was walking down the street with his backpack slung over one shoulder. He had just finished a long day at school and was eager to get home, grab a snack, and finish up his homework. His mind wandered as he looked down at his phone, scrolling through messages from his friends. He wasn't paying attention to the noise around him, the laughter of kids playing on the corner, or the honking cars zooming by. All he cared about was getting home and relaxing. The street was busy, but for Marcus, it felt peaceful. That is, until he heard a voice cut through the noise. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Startled, Marcus looked up to see a police officer walking toward him, a stern expression on his face. The officer had a hand on his belt, clearly in no rush, but with an air of authority that made Marcus nervous. He wasn't sure why the officer had stopped him, but there was something about the way he was looking at him that made his stomach turn. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, looking Marcus up and down, studying him as if he were some kind of puzzle he was trying to figure out. There was an uncomfortable silence before the officer spoke again. "Walking around here like you own the place, huh?" The officer said, his tone sharp and dismissive. "What are you doing here, boy? This isn't the kind of neighborhood for someone like you." Marcus was taken aback. He didn't understand what the officer meant. He lived in this neighborhood. It was where he had grown up, where he went to school, where his family had built their lives. But the way the officer was talking, it felt like he didn't belong here. It wasn't just the words. There was something in the officer's eyes, something that made Marcus feel like he was being judged for something he couldn't even understand. "I'm just heading home, sir," Marcus said, trying to explain himself. "I'm not doing anything wrong." But the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he crossed his arms and gave Marcus a long, hard look, as if he was trying to find a reason to keep the conversation going. The cop's voice grew louder, and his words began to sting. "Don't try to lie to me. I've seen your type before. Always trying to act like you're too good for the rules, but you're just another kid trying to cause trouble." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. His hands gripped his backpack straps tighter as his heart started to race. He hadn't done anything wrong. He didn't know why the officer was talking to him like this, but there was a growing feeling inside him, a feeling of being trapped in a situation that didn't make sense. He wanted to say something back. He wanted to shout and make the officer understand, but he couldn't. His mind raced, and the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood there, trying to figure out why this was happening. Why was the officer treating him like this? Was it because of the color of his skin, or was it something else? The longer the officer stood there, the more uncomfortable Marcus became. He could feel his face turning hot, and he knew that something wasn't right. He just didn't know what to do about it. The officer's words continued to sting, and Marcus couldn't understand why he was being singled out. Every time he tried to explain himself, the cop's eyes narrowed, and the officer seemed more and more convinced that Marcus was up to no good. It felt like a wave of frustration was building inside him, but he didn't know how to release it. "Just keep your hands where I can see them," the officer barked, his voice louder now. He was beginning to get agitated, like he was looking for something to justify his actions. Marcus froze for a moment, unsure of what was expected of him. His palms were sweating, and the weight of the officer's gaze felt like it was pressing down on him. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Marcus said again, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He was used to walking home this way, but something felt different this time, like he was suddenly an outsider in his own neighborhood. The officer shifted his stance, his eyes still studying Marcus. "Yeah? And why are you hanging around here so late, huh? Got yourself in trouble at school?" Your friends probably got you into some mess." The cop's assumptions stung even more. Marcus didn't have trouble at school, and he definitely wasn't hanging out with the wrong crowd. He was just a kid, trying to get home after a long day of classes. He could feel his cheeks flush, and he knew he was starting to get upset, but he was trying to keep it together. "I'm just walking home, sir. I've been doing it every day," Marcus repeated, though he felt like a broken record. He had hoped that if he said it enough, the officer would understand, but it didn't seem to be working. The cop wasn't finished, though. His next words were sharper, more pointed, almost as if he was daring Marcus to challenge him. "You think just anyone can walk around here and act like they own the place? I've seen your kind before. Don't act like you're any different." Marcus could feel the tension in his body. His fists were clenched tightly by his sides, his knuckles turning white. He was trying to hold it all in, but the more the officer spoke, the more his mind started to race. Why was this happening? Why was the officer treating him like this? He wanted to shout, to tell the officer that he didn't know anything about him, that he was just a kid trying to get by. But no words came. Instead, his thoughts swirled around like a storm in his head, all of them pointing back to one thing: the way the officer was looking at him. Marcus had been taught to respect authority, to stay calm in difficult situations, but right now, that wasn't easy. The officer wasn't listening, and it felt like the situation was spiraling out of control. His heart was racing now, and every second that passed seemed to stretch longer than the last. Then, something inside Marcus clicked. He didn't have to take this. He wasn't going to let the officer push him around. With his head held a little higher, he stood his ground and took a deep breath. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said once more, his voice firm. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew he had to speak up. The officer looked at him for a moment, as if trying to decide what to do next. The silence hung heavy in the air between them. Would the officer back off, or would this moment lead to something even worse? Marcus didn't know, but he was starting to realize that sometimes standing up for yourself wasn't easy, but it was necessary. As the tension in the air seemed to build, Marcus tried to steady himself, still unsure about what the officer would do next. He glanced around, hoping someone would step in, someone who could see how unfairly he was being treated. The street was still crowded with people hurrying by, but no one seemed to notice what was happening between the boy and the officer. From a distance, an older man sitting on a bench outside a small cafe had noticed the scene. He had been watching the interaction for a few minutes now, his brow furrowing in concern. He could see that the officer's approach was aggressive, and the way the young boy was standing, tense and uncomfortable, made him uneasy. The older man was no stranger to the way things could go wrong in situations like this, and he could feel the injustice unfolding. He didn't want to get involved directly. After all, it wasn't his business, and he had his own life to worry about. But there was something about the way the officer was speaking to Marcus that didn't sit right with him. The officer had no reason to treat the boy like this, not when he hadn't done anything wrong. The older man's instinct to protect someone in a vulnerable position kicked in. He stood up slowly from his seat, his eyes still fixed on the situation, waiting to see how it would unfold. As Marcus stood there, trying to find the right words, he felt more and more isolated. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his thoughts were racing. He kept wondering, why me? Why was this officer acting like this? What did I do to deserve this? He wanted to cry out, but he didn't want to give the officer any reason to escalate things further. He just wanted to get home. It was then that Marcus noticed the older man walking toward them. He didn't seem like the type of person to get involved in matters like this, but something in the way he was moving told Marcus that he wasn't just passing by. The older man had a determined look in his eyes, his steps quickening as he neared them. The officer hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on his conversation with Marcus. The older man cleared his throat as he approached, and his voice broke through the tense silence. "Is everything all right here?" he asked calmly, his gaze shifting between Marcus and the officer. The officer looked up, slightly surprised by the interruption. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as though unsure how to respond. His eyes narrowed at the man, his posture stiffening. "Everything's fine," he said, his tone still sharp. "Just having a little conversation with this young man here." The older man didn't back down. "It doesn't look like a conversation to me. It looks like you're treating this kid like he's done something wrong, when he hasn't. I've been watching from over there." Marcus felt a small sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't much, but the older man's presence gave him a bit of comfort. He wasn't completely alone in this. The officer seemed to feel the weight of the older man's words too, his expression tightening. "This is none of your business," the officer snapped, clearly annoyed by the interruption. But the older man wasn't intimidated. "Maybe it's not my business, but I don't like seeing people treated unfairly," he said, his voice steady but firm. "And it looks to me like you're treating this boy unfairly. What's your reason for stopping him?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but the older man cut him off before he could say anything. "I've been watching for a while, and he hasn't done anything wrong. He's just walking home." The older man turned to Marcus, offering him a small, reassuring smile. "You all right, kid?" Marcus nodded, grateful for the support, though he still felt uneasy. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it helped him feel like someone was finally standing up for him. He hadn't expected anyone to intervene, but here was this stranger, making it clear that he wasn't okay with what was happening. The officer, now caught off guard, glanced between Marcus and the older man. He seemed to weigh his next move carefully. The tension in the air remained thick, but the officer wasn't as sure of himself as he had been before. The older man's presence had shifted something in the situation. Marcus wasn't alone anymore, and somehow that made all the difference. The officer took a step back, clearly unsure of how to respond to the older man's firm stance. The situation had taken a turn that neither he nor Marcus had expected. For the first time since the interaction had begun, the officer seemed a bit unsettled. His confidence, which had been so strong just moments ago, began to waver. The older man didn't back down, his eyes steady on the officer, waiting for some kind of explanation. "What's going on here?" he asked again, his voice calm but full of authority. He wasn't shouting, but there was no mistaking the fact that he wasn't going to let this go. The officer, still trying to regain control of the situation, shifted on his feet, glancing at Marcus, then at the older man. For a moment, it felt like everything was at a standstill. The busy street continued around them, with people walking by, some pausing for a moment to glance at the scene unfolding, but no one dared to speak up. It was as if everyone was waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. The officer finally spoke, his tone less aggressive but still defensive. "I'm just doing my job," he said, but there was a hint of hesitation in his voice. "I've got to keep things in order around here. Can't let kids like this roam around without supervision." The older man raised an eyebrow. "Kids like this," he repeated, his voice soft but sharp. "You're assuming a lot based on the way he looks, aren't you?" His words weren't accusatory, but they cut through the air, making the officer pause. Marcus stood quietly, still trying to make sense of everything. He hadn't said anything in a while, still processing the situation. He was used to being quiet, to letting things happen around him, but something had shifted inside him. For the first time, he wasn't just a bystander in this moment. He was a part of it. And the way the officer was acting, the assumptions he was making, didn't sit right with him. Before Marcus could respond, the older man turned to him, giving him a small, knowing smile. "You're all right, kid," he said gently. "You've done nothing wrong. Keep your head up." His words, simple as they were, seemed to give Marcus a bit of strength. The boy nodded, though his heart was still racing. The officer, now clearly uncomfortable, shifted his gaze from the older man to Marcus, then back again. He wasn't sure how to handle this. The older man's intervention had thrown him off balance. The situation wasn't as simple as it had seemed when he first stopped Marcus. There was more to the story than he had assumed, and now he was caught in a moment of uncertainty. "Listen," the officer said, his voice quieter now. "I was just making sure everything was okay. You can go on now." It wasn't an apology, but it was as close as he was going to get. The power in his words had faded, replaced by an awkwardness that Marcus didn't expect. The older man, sensing the shift, stepped back, giving Marcus a final look of reassurance. "Don't let anyone make you feel small, kid. You've got a right to be here just like anyone else." With that, he turned and began walking back to his seat on the bench, leaving Marcus and the officer standing there, the tension still lingering in the air. Marcus took a deep breath. His nerves were still on edge, but he couldn't help feeling a small sense of relief. The officer might not have apologized, but the older man's intervention had made it clear that there were people who cared about what was right. He wasn't alone in this. He gave a brief glance at the officer, who seemed to be thinking about something, maybe reflecting on what had just happened. Marcus straightened his back, his feet slowly carrying him forward, taking one step at a time. It felt like a small victory. He wasn't sure what had changed, but something in him had shifted. He no longer felt like the officer's target, and as he walked away, he promised himself that next time, if something like this happened again, he wouldn't stay silent. He had a voice, and he wasn't afraid to use it. Marcus walked away from the scene, his heart still racing but his steps a little firmer than before. He couldn't shake the feeling of being targeted, but something had changed in him. The older man's intervention had made him realize that not everyone would stand by and let something unfair happen. That small act of kindness, of speaking up when it wasn't easy, had made a huge difference. It was a moment Marcus would remember, a reminder that people could make a difference, even in situations that seemed hopeless. As he continued down the street, his thoughts lingered on the officer's words. "Kids like this," the officer had said. Marcus still couldn't fully understand why the officer had singled him out. He was just a kid, walking home, like hundreds of other kids in the neighborhood. But in that moment, he had been seen as a problem, a threat. And for what? Because of the color of his skin. He couldn't help but wonder how many times something like this had happened to others, how many times people had been judged for things they couldn't control. Marcus shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. He didn't want to dwell on it. It wasn't easy to understand, and he didn't have all the answers. But one thing was clear to him. He wasn't going to let this experience define him. He wasn't going to let the officer's words make him feel small. He was more than just someone to be judged. His pace slowed as he approached his block, his home just around the corner. The familiar sights of his neighborhood, his street, his building, the park where he used to play as a kid, offered him some comfort. But even as he walked past the familiar houses, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that still lingered in his chest. The encounter with the officer wasn't something he could just forget. It had shaken him, and it would likely stay with him for a long time. As he turned onto his street, his eyes found his building in the distance. He knew his mom was probably home by now, and he couldn't wait to tell her about his day. The thought of seeing her gave him a sense of calm. She always knew what to say when he had questions, when things didn't make sense. He could talk to her about anything. Maybe tonight he'd tell her about what happened, about the officer and the older man. Maybe she'd have some insight that could help him understand it all better. But even as he thought about his mom, Marcus knew that there were bigger things at play here. This wasn't just about one officer or one moment in time. This was a reality that affected people every day, all over the country. People being judged, misunderstood, treated unfairly based on who they were, based on their race, their background. It wasn't right, and Marcus knew that it wasn't something that could just be ignored. He took a deep breath as he reached his building, feeling the weight of the day lift just a little. He'd faced something difficult, but he had handled it. And while it hadn't been easy, he had learned something important. Standing up for yourself, even when it feels hard, can make a difference. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, But he was determined to keep moving forward. The world might try to put labels on him, to judge him for things that weren't fair, but Marcus knew he had the power to define who he was, not anyone else. As he entered his building, he walked toward the elevator, ready to head up to his apartment. The day was winding down, but he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of resolve settling in. Maybe tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he was ready to face them. The encounter with the officer had been hard, but it had made him stronger. It had taught him something important, something he would carry with him always. His voice mattered, and no one could take that away from him. As Marcus stepped into his apartment, the familiar smell of dinner filled the air. His mom was busy in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she chopped vegetables for their meal. The comforting sounds of her movements, the soft clatter of a knife against a cutting board, always made him feel at ease. He took a deep breath and walked over to her. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice quieter than usual. She turned, offering him a warm smile. "Hey, baby, how was your day? You look like you've been through something." Marcus didn't know how to explain it all. He didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but at the same time, it had been a big deal for him. The feeling of being unfairly targeted, the confusion and frustration, it was something he couldn't ignore. But he also didn't want to worry his mom. She already had enough on her plate. Still, he knew she could tell there was something on his mind. She always could. "It was fine," he started, his words a bit unsure. "Well, actually, something happened on my way home." His mom raised an eyebrow, setting the knife down for a moment as she looked at him closely. "What happened?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure how to phrase it. He didn't want to sound like he was complaining, but he also needed to talk about it. "I got stopped by a cop on my way home." His mom's expression changed instantly, and she walked over to him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "A cop? What happened, Marcus?" He could feel the weight of her concern, and it made him more determined to get it all out. He took a deep breath and told her everything. How the officer had stopped him, the harsh words he had used, the way he'd been treated like a criminal for no reason. He explained how the cop had made assumptions about him without even knowing him, and how the older man had stepped in, making the officer back off. His mom listened quietly, her face serious but calm. She didn't interrupt him. She just let him speak, allowing him to process the feelings he had been holding in all afternoon. When he finished, she gave him a long, steady look, as if weighing everything he had said. "I'm proud of you, Marcus," she said softly, "for staying calm, for standing your ground." Marcus felt a mix of relief and confusion. He had expected his mom to be upset, maybe even angry at what had happened, but she wasn't. She was proud of him, and that made him feel a little better, though the knot in his stomach hadn't gone away. "I didn't really know what to do," Marcus admitted. "I just wanted it to be over." His mom nodded. "I know, baby. It's never easy when something like that happens, but sometimes standing up for yourself is the hardest thing to do. And I'm proud that you did." She took a step back, picking up the knife again and continuing to chop the vegetables. "But you know, this is something that happens a lot. Not just to you, but to a lot of people. And it's not right. It's something we have to keep fighting against." Marcus looked at her, a little surprised. "You mean it happens to other people too?" His mom paused for a moment, turning to face him. "Yes, sweetheart. It happens every day. People are judged for who they are, where they come from, and the color of their skin. And it's wrong, but that's the world we live in right now. But that doesn't mean we can't change it, one person at a time. It starts with speaking up, just like you did today." Marcus felt a little lighter. His mom's words gave him a new perspective. He had always known that things weren't always fair, but hearing her say it out loud, hearing that it wasn't just him, made him realize that he wasn't alone in this. "I guess it just feels scary, you know," Marcus said quietly. "I know, baby," she replied. "It is scary, but you're stronger than you think, and you're not alone. You've got me. you've got your family. And most importantly, you've got your voice. And that's a powerful thing. The weight in Marcus's chest lightened a little more. His mom's calm reassurance was exactly what he needed. He had been carrying the frustration of the day around with him, unsure how to handle it. But now he felt a little more equipped to face whatever came next. Dinner was ready soon after, and they sat down together at the table, the conversation moving to other things: homework, upcoming plans, and small talk that made Marcus feel like everything was normal again. But in the back of his mind, he knew something had shifted. He had faced a challenge, and although it wasn't over, he had taken the first step toward understanding that he could be part of the change. As they finished their meal, Marcus felt a quiet resolve settle in. The world might be complicated, unfair even, but he was ready to stand up for what was right, not just for himself, but for others too. The next few days felt different for Marcus. The encounter with the officer and the support he'd received from the older man had left a lasting impact on him. He didn't feel the same way he did before, when things were just easy and routine. Now, when he walked down the street, he looked at things differently. He noticed how people interacted with each other, how some treated others with kindness, while others were quick to judge or make assumptions based on appearances. At school, he felt a sense of awareness that he hadn't before. The way some of his classmates spoke about things, the way they dismissed issues they didn't understand, it all seemed to hit him harder now. He knew he couldn't just let those things slide anymore. He didn't know exactly how, but he wanted to do something about it. He wanted to speak up when he saw something wrong, even if it wasn't always easy. It wasn't long before Marcus had a chance to put his thoughts into action. One afternoon, as he was leaving school, he noticed a group of kids gathered around near the gate. They were laughing and pointing at something, or rather someone. Marcus squinted, trying to see what was going on. As he walked closer, he saw it was a younger boy, maybe in middle school, who was standing alone. The kids were laughing at him, making fun of the way he looked, his clothes, his haircut. It didn't take long for Marcus to realize that they were bullying him. Something inside Marcus stirred. He couldn't just stand by and let this happen. He remembered how he felt when he was treated unfairly, how powerless he had felt. He didn't want that for anyone else. He couldn't just walk away. Taking a deep breath, Marcus walked up to the group of kids. The laughter died down as they noticed him approaching. The young boy standing in the middle of the circle looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment. Marcus could see the fear in his eyes, the way he shrunk under the weight of the laughter. "Hey guys," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "What's going on here?" One of the kids, a tall boy with messy hair, sneered. "None of your business, Marcus. Just having a little fun." "Does it look like fun to you?" Marcus asked, his gaze turning to the boy in the middle. "How would you feel if someone did this to you?" The group shifted uncomfortably. The tall boy looked at Marcus, then back at the others. The energy in the air was different now, less playful, more tense. "I'm just saying," Marcus continued, his voice not wavering. "If you've got nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. This isn't cool." The group of kids stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. They had been caught off guard by Marcus's response, and no one was quite sure how to handle it. The silence hung in the air, and Marcus could feel the weight of the moment. He wasn't trying to start a fight. He just wanted to make things right. The tall boy, still looking unsure, muttered something under his breath and turned away. Slowly, the others followed suit, their group disbanding as they walked off in different directions. The young boy, who had been the target of the teasing, finally looked up at Marcus with a small, grateful smile. "Thanks," he said quietly. Marcus nodded, offering him a reassuring smile. "No problem. Don't let them get to you. You're better than that." As the boy walked away, Marcus felt a sense of pride in his chest. It wasn't much, but he had made a difference, even if it was just for one person. And that made it worth it. As he turned to leave, he realized that standing up for what was right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. He couldn't change the world in one day, but he could take small steps to make it a little better. He had learned that from the officer's encounter, and now he was putting it into practice. He felt stronger, more confident, ready to face whatever came his way. He wasn't going to stay silent anymore. He knew that even the smallest action could make a big difference. Marcus walked home that day with a sense of purpose, knowing that change wasn't something that just happened. It was something you had to work for, something you had to fight for, one step at a time. And that's exactly what he planned to do. A few weeks passed since Marcus had stood up for the younger boy, and he felt different now. The once familiar weight of uncertainty and fear had begun to lift, replaced by a quiet confidence he hadn't known he had. He still remembered that day with the officer, how helpless he had felt at first. But now he looked at the world with new eyes. Every moment where someone was treated unfairly, every time he saw a situation that needed someone to speak up, Marcus knew that he had the power to make a difference. One afternoon, as Marcus walked home from school, he passed the same street corner where the officer had stopped him. The memories flooded back, but this time they didn't bring the same feeling of fear or frustration. Instead, they reminded him of how far he had come, how much he had grown since that day. He wasn't the same kid he had been then. He was stronger, more aware, and most importantly, more willing to take action. As he walked past the corner, something caught his eye. A group of people were gathered around a bench, and from the looks of it, there was some kind of disagreement happening. Marcus slowed down, watching the scene unfold. He saw a woman, perhaps in her 30s, standing with her arms crossed, her face red with frustration. Beside her, a young man looked upset, his hands raised in an attempt to explain something. The woman seemed angry, and the man was trying to calm her down, but it was clear neither of them was getting anywhere. Without thinking, Marcus stepped forward, his instinct taking over. He didn't know what had happened, but he could see that the situation was escalating. The people around the bench were starting to take sides, whispering to each other, judging the situation from a distance. Marcus knew that if things didn't calm down, it could easily spiral out of control. "Hey, what's going on here?" Marcus asked, his voice clear and calm as he approached the two of them. His words cut through the tension, drawing the attention of everyone around. The woman turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "None of your business," she snapped. But Marcus didn't back down. He had seen how quickly things could get out of hand, and he wasn't about to let this situation get worse. "It's not my business, but I don't like seeing people upset. Maybe I can help." For a moment, there was silence. The woman didn't know how to respond, and the young man looked at Marcus with a mixture of surprise and relief. "You can help?" the man asked, his voice hopeful. "I'll listen," Marcus said, stepping a little closer. "Maybe if you both just talk to each other for a minute, things will get clearer." The woman glanced at him, still hesitant, but after a few seconds, she sighed and uncrossed her arms. The young man spoke first, explaining his side of the situation. He talked about a misunderstanding, how he had accidentally said something that upset her, and how he had tried to apologize, but hadn't been able to get the right words across. As he spoke, Marcus could see the woman's expression soften, though she was still frustrated. The more the young man explained, the more the tension seemed to ease. When it was her turn to speak, she explained her perspective, her voice still tinged with frustration, but more controlled. She talked about how hurt she had felt by what he said, how it had caught her off guard. Slowly, as they both spoke, the anger began to dissipate. They were no longer shouting at each other. Instead, they were listening. After a few minutes, the conversation had shifted from accusations to understanding. The woman took a deep breath, and the young man apologized again, this time more sincerely. The tension that had been thick in the air just moments ago seemed to melt away. They both smiled faintly at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Marcus stepped back, watching the scene unfold. He hadn't done much, he hadn't solved their problems, but he had helped them find a way to talk, to listen. That was all it took. Sometimes, all it took was someone to stand in the middle and remind people that communication, understanding, and patience could turn things around. As the woman and young man walked away, their disagreement behind them, Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction. He had helped. He had stepped in and helped two strangers find common ground, just like he had learned to do for himself. In the past, he might have walked past, minding his own business, but now he knew better. The world could be a better place if people just stopped and listened to each other. Marcus smiled to himself as he walked away. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was more certain now than ever that he would keep standing up for what was right, no matter the situation. He didn't need to be a hero. He just needed to be someone who cared, someone who was willing to make the world a little better, one small action at a time. And that was enough.